All right. So back at it last week. We'll do a quick review here. Um, Hopefully not too quickly here. We'll see. Last week we finished up the Old Testament canon. Um, and we were discussing the canon list criteria for the Old Testament. And so when we got into that, we talked about who wrote the book. We didn't get into a whole lot of these other ones, but they'll come up again. So who wrote the book? When was the book written? What language was it written in? Was the book in the Hebrew canon? And has the book been read and received in the churches? And those last two were the two we primarily focused on because they were the center of most of these debates regarding the Old Testament and what should be included in the book. So the other ones did play a part. They were weighed, if you will, but they weren't weighed quite as heavily. It was those last two canon criteria were the ones that were most hotly disputed. And so we wanted to talk about how did the early church come to its canon? Because the previous week we dealt with how did the Hebrews view their canon, and we worked through that. Now we're going through the early church, and we started with Melito of Sardis. He's the earliest guy we have that talks about the Old Testament canon. And his job, he was co-pastoring a church, so his job was to go down to Israel from Sardis and learn from the rabbis as to what they held as their Hebrew canon. And then he reported back. And this is about 170 AD, just so you guys have a timeline, 170 AD. So we're into the late 2nd century. And we talked about where we were. Remember when we talked about the Hebrew canon, where we were in the late 2nd century. One of the books that was still being disputed in the late 2nd century by the Hebrews was the Book of Esther. And so when Melito returned to give his canon list, the Book of Esther was not in his canon list. So it was the same canon list as the Protestant canon, minus the Book of Esther. At the same time, we've discovered a list called what we call the Byrenius list. The Byrenius list is named after the person who discovered it, and it dates to roughly about the same time as the Melito list. And that list contained the exact same list as the Protestant canon. The only debate was to what it meant when it said 1st and 2nd Esdras. Was it referring to our 1st and 2nd Esdras, which is Ezra and Nehemiah, or was it referring to an apocryphal set of Esdras, which would have been part of the Ethiopian canon list? That's the only debate. We're not entirely sure, but we're nearly certain it has to be Ezra and Nehemiah, largely because Ezra and Nehemiah otherwise aren't in the list. So, and since Ezra and Nehemiah is generally, they are not disputed books, those are the ones that were generally agreed upon. And then we worked through Gregory of Nazianzus. We're going to talk about him again. Gregory of Nazianzus, he is highly respected among Greek Orthodox and Roman Church theologians, and he gives us a canon list. He lists it out, and in his canon list, he gives us the exact same canon list as the Protestant canon, minus the Book of Esther. So that we saw as a common theme. We talked about other people who had canon lists as well. And then we talked about Athanasius and his Easter letters. And he lists out the canon for us. Let's see here. We'll go ahead and just click right to his canon list instead of reading his Easter letter again. And this is what consisted of his canon list. So his canon list is in green. The blue books were not considered canon, but they were considered good and helpful. And so Esther is in the good and helpful section as opposed to the canon list. And then you also have Tobit, Judith, Wisdom, and Ecclesiasticus. And then we have two other books that we haven't talked about. We probably will get to it next week, the Didache and the Shepherd of Hermes. Okay, those were in his. And then we get into Augustine on the Christian canon, and this becomes the crux. at this point, the debate's coming kind of to a head, and Augustine is going to have his view on how to determine the canon, to determine the canon list. And if you read this quote here, you'll realize he does not have the Hebrews in view at all. He's not considering going to the Hebrews. The Hebrews aren't on his list of resources for discovering the canon list, which becomes what John Mead calls the criteria crunch. So the Hebrew criterion means that we as Christians should do what Romans 3:2 says, which is to go to the Hebrews and see what they had for their canon list, since they were given the canon. And the church criterion is to not worry about what the Jews had, but to just look at what churches have historically been using as canon. And this becomes the debate between Jerome and Augustine. This is the same debate that's going to reoccur in the Reformation. And so if we go to our canon list, Jerome's canon list becomes identical to that of what we call the Protestant canon list, and Augustine's canon list becomes identical to that which we would call the Roman Church canon list. And in all of that, we get to the question of, well, who is right? Who is right? And this is the part I struggle with, because I don't want to adjudicate in matters of these, because these guys are theological giants. I'm learning from them, not the other way around. But also, they are just human, and they make mistakes. They get things wrong, and clearly one of them has to be wrong. They can't both be right. And so this has been the question throughout church history: who is right between these two? And it's been worked through multiple times. Obviously, it was worked through again when we got to the Reformation. Romans 3:1 and 2 was heavily leaned upon, both in the early church and during the Reformation, to suggest that, one, there was a closed canon, two, that that it was the Hebrews that would have had it. And what we get, Athanasius, when we read Athanasius, he gave us 3 divisions of books in his quote. And those 3 divisions carry through church history. We still use them today, although we're not quite as explicit about it. So Athanasius gave three categories. The first category was the canon, right? The canon. These are the springs of our salvation. They are authoritative for doctrine. The second category was apocryphal, that it was good and useful, but not authoritative. And then the third category was rejected writings that were rejected, not to be used for worship or edification. And so in those books, the rejected ones, we had things like the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Peter, and a whole bunch of other books that were deemed heretical and not good and useful. And then we had the good and useful books, which were what we would consider the Apocrypha. Now, plus there's other ones that we'll get into in the New Testament, but like Athanasius had in his, the Didache and the Shepherd of Hermes were good and useful, but not canonical. Those would be more related to the New Testament than the Old Testament, so that's a separate section. And so we worked through that. And then I asked the question, so if the apocryphal books are good and useful, and I asked how many people here had actually read from them, and most people, well, not most, but roughly 6 or so of the people in here that were in here suggested that they had read something. I'm going to ask a second question today. How many of you have read through an entire book of anything in the Apocrypha? An entire book, not just a phrase, but like cover to cover. Okay, 0. So that's actually just as much revealing. So we've gone from the Apocrypha, which used to be read and used in churches regularly, both through the Reformation period and the early church, and we've read portions of the Apocrypha, maybe sections here or there, but no one in here, from what I could tell, no one raised their hand to suggest that they'd read a whole book. I have read through 1st and 2nd Maccabees more than once. Outside of that, I have not spent a lot of time in any of the other apocryphal books, but I intend to change that. And I suggest that we all should change that to some degree, because the apocryphal books have been always deemed as good and useful, not canon, not perfect, not that we would agree with everything that is in all of these books. And so I did raise the question, what changed? What changed in our current church culture that we went from apocryphal books being good and useful to now essentially abstained from? Like, we don't hardly touch them at all. I suggested that I think part of the reason was how the Westminster Confession of Faith handled it. Now, the Westminster Confession of Faith, I don't have a disagreement with this phrase. I think the phrase is good, but the way it's phrased, I think, has caused many people to reject using the apocryphal books at all. And so it says, the books commonly called apocrypha, not being of divine inspiration, agreed, are no part of the canon of Scripture, agreed, and therefore of no authority in the Church of God, agreed, nor to be any otherwise approved. And I think that line, taken out of context, taken away from the next line, or made use of other than other human writings, right? And so we do this pretty frequently in our preaching, in our teaching. In fact, I've done this frequently through this. The beginning of my class, I gave you a whole bunch of books that I considered good and useful, and books that I said not so good and useful. That was the beginning of this class. We do this frequently. This is part of our teaching, that we recommend books. We quote from books outside of the canon, and we all recognize that they're not canon, that they're not perfect, that they're not gonna agree with everything we say in every point all the time. But for some reason, we have done away with the apocryphal books. Now, oh yeah, I have read some of Sirach as well, and I found that to be very edifying. But the way I think this has been handled is within a couple hundred years, the 1800s, we removed the books from the Bible, the apocryphal books from the Bible. They stopped getting printed. I think that's part of the issue. They're not printed nearly as frequently, like even as a separate book. And the only way to really get them is to buy a Catholic book. And since there was such heat between Protestants and Catholics, as it still is today, this would have been something unthinkable. Also, I think there's a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction when the Roman Church anathematizes us for not seeing the apocryphal books as canon. And so as a reaction, we would just greatly disagree, and we would just not use them at all. And maybe this is what we would call an overreaction, an overcorrection. Instead of putting them in their proper place, we overcorrect and we don't use them at all. So there's that. Even John Calvin, when, okay, shooting from the hip here, not in my notes, but John Calvin, when he read the Council of Trent and he saw the anathematization, I pretty much butchered that word, but he saw the anathema. I was going to try to create a brand new word there. It didn't work. He saw the anathema from the Roman Church. He said there would be certain doctrines that they would push from these apocryphal books. He said from Maccabees, they would push purgatory, and from another, I forget what it was. I don't have the list in front of me, but he does say that there's going to be a rise in false doctrines because of these books being viewed as canon, which is correct. If you view them as canon, then they do instruct you in matters of faith and doctrine. If you don't, then they don't. And so, so this was a legitimate concern from Calvin that this would be the case, and we would have to have answers prepared for that. One of the answers, which we had from Luther, was it's not canon, so we don't have to get doctrine from it, which is true. The other thing is to find it taught elsewhere in Scripture, because we ought not to, as a general principle, we ought not to ever create doctrine off of a single verse. It should be taught explicitly throughout Scripture in multiple places. All right, and then that brings us back. That's where we ended last week. Is I suggested, hey, we should put the apocryphal back where it was, as good and useful. We should consider reading it. It should be in our reading list. And I gave you a resource to do that. I said you could use the NRSV or the NRSVU. We'll talk about the NRSV and NRSVU translation itself. I'm not a super huge fan of it. I'll explain why. But as far as the apocryphal books are concerned, I think it does a fine job. And the other thing you could do, we'll get to this as well, is you could get an English copy of the Septuagint. The English copy of the Septuagint would also have the same apocryphal books in it. And we'll cover that in a bit as well. I'll give you some recommendations for Septuagint, English Septuagints. All right, and then kind of wanted to circle back a little bit to this Leipzig disputation of 1519. And this becomes, remember, we dealt with this with Jerome and Augustine. Clearly, it wasn't settled. So if we go back to the Leipzig disputation of 1519 and this Protestant versus Roman Church framing of the debate, is the canon a list of authoritative books, or is the canon an authoritative list of books? And I want to just kind of drive home the point of the issue here regarding the logical conclusion of these two frames. So we have the Protestant list of authoritative books in which we're suggesting that the books are authoritative. The problem is we just need to recognize which ones are authoritative and which ones aren't. And this is our issue. Then you have the Roman Church canon list, which they're going to say it's authoritative because we've said it's authoritative, right? So we've made the claim it's authoritative. We put it in the list. And by the very nature of putting it in the list, it's authoritative. Whereas Protestants were saying, no, not so. We just are trying to figure out which books are authoritative, and they are the ones going in the list. And so then you have the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. They're very much in the same philosophy as the Protestants in recognizing the canon. They have a canon list, and they're saying, hey, we just want to know which ones are authoritative. However, they're open to suggestion. We talked about this, that they have a more flexible canon, that they could have too many books in the canon, but not, so they, flexible, I like the term flexible the more I've thought about it. In a flexible canon, we know what the upper limit is, right? We know where the boundary, where the flexibility ends, and anything beyond that will break it, okay? So to add books to break their flexibility, it would become an open canon. So they have an upper limit. They just don't know what the lower limit is. They're not entirely sure what the lower limit of their canon is. Maybe we have too many books in our canon. Maybe we don't. There are definitely books that are undisputed within Eastern Orthodox, but there are other books, and Ethiopian, other books that are disputed within their own denomination. But again, they're in the same line. They want a list of authoritative books. They don't believe their list is authoritative, but that the books in the list are authoritative. And so this becomes the crux here. If the framing is, if the Roman Catholic Church is correct, that the canon is an authoritative list, then we don't see a list from the Roman Church that overlaps exactly with their canon list until the Synod at Hippo at almost 400 AD. At almost 400 AD. That means that the canon's not settled until 400 AD. However, it's clearly still not settled because Jerome and Augustine are only going to debate about it 50 years later. So they didn't see that as authoritative. So then the next time we see it is going to be, I think, the Council of Florence. The Council of Florence. I don't have the date in front of me. I think it's mid-1400s. I'm just going to say that. Mid to late 1400s. Mid to late 1400s, we have the Council of Florence. I mentioned that. I didn't get into it because I think it's less relevant to the debate. But the Council of Florence, again, is going to give a canon list, and that canon list will overlap with the Catholic canon list. And, but again, so that's what Cardinal Eck, remember that conversation? He leans on Council of Florence. I find it interesting that he leans on the Council of Florence and not the Synod at Hippo, right? That's telling in and of itself that he didn't see the Synod at Hippo as authoritative, but he went to the Council at Florence. But the problem is, this is why it was so crucial for Luther to bring in his contemporaries, where he brought in Cardinal Ximenes, Cardinal Tacitus, and Erasmus, that those were Roman Catholic scholars, and they disagreed with Eck, suggesting that the Council of Florence itself also wasn't authoritative because there was still dispute in the church. Erasmus said these are not universally accepted. There's still dispute on these things. So then that settles it at the Council of Trent. Council of Trent says this is it, which, if that is the authoritative list, that means the church does not have a closed canon or a canon until the Reformation. Until the Reformation. Now, I find that fascinating and unbelievable that the church wouldn't know what was in our canon list until the Reformation. If it is the case that the canon is the list of the authoritative books, or the authoritative list of books, So that becomes a problem for me. Even if I grant them the earliest date, that still means they don't have a canon until the 400 ADs. And that becomes a point of contention. When I debate with Roman Catholics on the issue, they will say it was the Roman Church who gave us the canon. They will say the Roman Church gave us the canon. When they say that, they're using that view that the Roman Church came with the authoritative list. They will also say, I'll hear atheists or Muslims or non-Christians say the church didn't even have a canon until 400 AD. It was decided at the Council of Nicaea, which the Council of Nicaea didn't even address the canon. So that's it. That's all I'm going to talk about that. I said earlier I would talk about the Council of Nicaea. That's it. There's nothing else to talk about. It's not talked about. If they want to talk about it, they need to talk about the Synod at Hippo or the Council at Carthage. Both of those give a canon list. And Rome's response that was the same canon list they were working with. So ultimately, if you buy into that the canon is an authoritative list of books, then yeah, the early church, the church at 200 AD, didn't have that list. They didn't have a canon. The church at 150 AD didn't have a canon. The church at 250 AD didn't have a canon. The church at 1500 didn't have a canon until the Council of Trent. Now, furthermore, I didn't look into this personally because I didn't feel the need to, but John Meade, I've referenced him a few times. He's a major source for me on some of the subjects. He says this, and I tend to trust him, so I'll take it at that, but feel free to fact check me and him. He says that he read the minutes to the Council of Trent. He worked through the minutes and the notes and the discussions that took place that led to the Council of Trent, that led to the anathema that would come with it. And in his view, and not just his view, there are Catholic historians who do the same thing, who say the same thing as him, that the Council of Trent, the men involved in that council, did not see themselves as ending the dispute between the Protestant and Roman canon, meaning that they didn't think that this was the end of the discussion. They did not think that when they were writing the anathema, for whatever reason. To me, this just blows my mind. How do you write the anathema and not think you're not putting a period at the end of this discussion? But apparently, within the minutes, they did not believe that they were ending the conversation and closing the canon. And so even one of the Catholic historians I was reading, he said that this is a fault of the men at the Council of Trent for having ambiguity in the Council of Trent's letter that we read, that last section there. If that's true, then they still don't have a closed canon. Then this is still up for debate. I don't know if it's true. To me, if they want to say that the letter was written such that it could be misunderstood, it seems clearly misunderstood to me. Like, I don't struggle to read that and understand what they're saying. You don't accept this, you're anathematized. So that's a big deal to me. So if it's the case, it's still worth debating, apparently. I just don't see the Council of Trent giving room, regardless of whether or not the men saw it that way. All right. And that ends the Old Testament canon for us, okay? And I think this is the logical conclusion of the Roman Church position. If it's an authoritative list, then we don't have early churches or even middle-aged churches until the Reformation having an actual canon. I think that's a very, very strong weakness in our argument. Whereas on the Protestant list, we could suggest, hey, we're just not sure, and we need to find them, and we believe we have found them, And we have listed those multiple times in many places and through tradition demonstrated that the Old Testament canon is the way we have it. But it didn't just fall into our laps that way. There was some work that had to be done in order to determine this. And it took some time for churches to work through that. And that's the case on every issue. Just look up any doctrine and start working through church history, and you'll see that every doctrine had to be worked through. It's biblical, but we weren't dropped all of our doctrines, including our canon, in the lap and been like, here it is. I've been working on the Trinity as a hobby project for many years. The Trinity itself is a long process. It's clearly believed early, but the words and the nuance and the teachings and how the persons interact with each other and so on and so forth, this is worked through and struggled through and fought through for a couple hundred years before we have what we have today. And it's still, oh man, I'm getting into modern day debates over the Trinity within Christendom. And it's still a disputed issue because it's that complicated. So we're still working through it. And so we should do that with humility and understand we're probably not going to always get to the answer every time. So let's talk about the New Testament canon. Okay, we're done with the Old Testament canon. Let's look at the New Testament canon. Where are we with the New Testament canon? So we'll do the same thing. We're going to pull up the 4 Christian canons, and we'll look at the differences between them. So here are the 4 Christian canons. We have the Protestant, the Roman, the Eastern Orthodox, and the Ethiopian Orthodox. And if you're paying attention, you will notice that these lists look pretty identical. And the reason why is because they are. Right? Within the New Testament, the Protestant, the Roman Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church all agree on the New Testament canon. There are no books that we hold in disputation today. Okay? But that has not always been the case. Okay, this was we worked through the New Testament canon as well. And I considered, because of how long this class has been going and where I am in my actual outline, to just not even spend a lot of time on this issue because it's agreed upon today. There's no disputation between any of the denominations as to what the New Testament canon should look like. And by the way, I did put on here, like, if you notice, these are all significantly longer names than what we generally just say Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But I'm putting what has been traditionally the full name up there. So Acts of the Apostles, Paul's epistle to the Romans, Paul's first epistle to the Corinthians instead of 1 Corinthians, Paul's second epistle to the Corinthians as opposed to 2 Corinthians. The Revelation of John, also called the Apocrypha of John, has been up there, has been called that. So those are the full names. I decided to put the full names up there. So that's that. So what these books have not always been accepted by the churches, not all of them. And it took some time for that to happen as well. Let's see here. Yeah, so I want to bring that back up. But because this is not disputed, some people might say, why talk about it? And that was the question I was wrestling with as well. What if it's not disputed, should we spend time on this? And I think I'm kind of going to go with an Athanasius here. I'm going to go back to Athanasius. And he said, hey, I know that this is probably obvious to you. Be patient with me. Some people need a reminder. So we're going to go ahead and do that. We're going to walk through church history, and we're going to talk about some of these issues that happen through church history, because if for no other reason, I do think there's some value in this, because just because our past has settled it doesn't mean necessarily that our future will continue to have it settled. And when it comes up in the future, we should be prepared with how to answer this by looking to the past. And if all we say is, well, that's how we've always done it, then it won't be a good answer. And in fact, this very thing did happen during the Reformation. This was settled long before the Reformation, the New Testament canon, long before the Reformation. There weren't disputed books during the Reformation, except for Luther. So when we get to Remember this Leipzig disputation. We talked about the Protestant having a list of authoritative books, which we just belabored, that which has been defined by in church history and the Jewish people. But Luther, remember, he had a separate criteria for his canon. The criteria for canon during the Reformation becomes the same as that which Jerome said. But Luther had his own criteria, and his criteria was the books must clearly present the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ through faith, and any book that didn't, excuse me, would be secondary. And when we looked at that, we saw that he had a change of view in the book of Esther, right? He went from accepting the Protestant Old Testament canon the same way we do today to rejecting the book of Esther. Now, this is, I didn't talk about this, or at least I didn't make this point. So I'm going to make this point now with regard to the book of Esther and Luther. We walked through and we saw that the book of Esther took a long time to be accepted into the Old Testament canon. It was the last book in our canon that was received. That being said, the book of Esther, throughout its disputation, was always viewed as either canon or good and useful, right? It was either in the canon or as part of the apocryphal books that were good and useful. Eventually, it found its way into the canon. We received it. That being said, Luther did not have that view of Esther. He did not see the book of Esther as good and useful. Remember, when he started to reject it, he called it pagan and heathen. So he rejected the book outright. Now, that is not in his early, in the 1522, 1536, 1538 editions of the German Luther Bible. The book of Esther was always in there, and he had high praise for it in the prologue. So this was a later development in his life where he rejected the book of Esther. Well, I told you that this criteria for his canon would affect the New Testament more than it did the Old Testament. It affected the book of Esther, but not only the book of Esther, it also affected some New Testament books. So if you look at the German Luther Bible, on the right-hand side is how it's listed in German. All right, so this is a page of his German table of contents. Okay, and if you look here, I just rewrote it in English for you. This was the slide I was like trying to make just before you got here, because I remembered I wanted to make this and I forgot. And so if you look, you'll see that this New Testament canon is identical to ours, but then he has a section at the end that are the disputed books. The disputed books. This is the epistle to the Hebrews. He puts Hebrews in the disputed books. And the reason being, we're going to talk about Hebrews. That's where most of this lesson, the rest of this lesson is going to land on, is let's talk about Hebrews. But he rejects the book of, not rejects, he disputes the book of Hebrews because of its authorship. We're not sure what its authorship is. He did not believe it was Paul, and therefore, because of that, he put it in the disputed books. This debate is still happening today. And the issue, the real issue with this situation here is this issue, is at some point, someone could get up and say, I don't think Hebrews should be considered part of our canon. And then maybe they get dogmatic. Hebrews ought not to be part of our canon. Well, we need to have some answers for that. And so Luther raised the objection. There was a possibility that the Protestant Reformation could have looked at what he said and said, yeah, Luther's right. This book is disputed. We should remove it from our canon. If that happens today, we should be able to push back against that person the same way the Protestant Reformation ultimately pushes back against Luther and does not see these as disputed books. All right. He also disputed the Epistle of James. This, he often referenced James as the Epistle of Straw because it did not have a strong argument for faith. It seemed to emphasize works. And because of that, he said, well, that's part of his criteria, right? Let's go back to his criteria real quick. The books must clearly present the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ through faith. Any book that didn't would be secondary. So in his view, James does not have a strong position on faith. So it's the epistle of straw. He puts that in the disputed books. The epistle of Jude, he saw seemingly, from what I could tell, just because of how short it was, he found it to be unimportant. Not in his criteria, but not as important as the other books. I could not find a theological reason, just that it's small, it's not so important. Obviously not a good reason to reject it. And then the last one, the Revelation of John, or the Apocalypse of John, that one he struggled to interpret it, and he struggled to see interpretational or applicational value in it, and therefore he said, secondary. It's hard to interpret, hard to understand, and by the way, it's still hard to interpret and hard to understand, and hard to apply, and so on and so forth. And so he saw it as secondary. The Protestant Reformation does not latch on to Luther's disputed books. There is no other, as far as I'm aware, there's no other Bible that is released outside of the German Luther Bible that separates these books at the bottom and calls them disputed. So this is a uniquely Luther thing. Tyndale didn't do it, and Tyndale loves Luther. Tyndale's a massive fan of Luther, and he doesn't do this. In fact, Coverdale doesn't do it. The Great Bible doesn't do it, at least English Bibles. I would have to look to see if any other Bible outside of German Bibles would have done this, but I'm not aware of any. As far as I know, that this is the only one that did that. And so we go back to the canon list criteria, and this becomes the question in early churches, and it's reframed in the Reformation as well. But again, it's not really disputed by anybody except Luther, so it does not gain any traction. But these become the criteria list for the New Testament, which is going to look very similar to the Old Testament. One, who wrote the book? Who wrote it? This is becomes the primary question. And so the question is, was it one of the apostles or apostolic men? And all that means is men who are closely associated with an apostle, such that the apostle could approve his work. For example, we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We have 4 Gospels, but only 2 of them are written by apostles, Matthew and John. Mark and Luke, neither of them are apostles. And so they're not written by an apostle. However, you go through church history, and we will. Mark is written as Peter's preaching. This is how Peter preached. So Mark is writing Peter's testimony of the gospel. So we have the Gospel of Mark in Peter's voice, although written and penned by Mark himself. Then we have Luke. Luke clearly says, I am not an eyewitness to these events, but I interviewed eyewitnesses, and he was a traveling companion of Paul. And so Paul, being an apostle, could give his stamp of approval on the Gospel of Mark. So who wrote the book becomes a big deal. And this is the same thing, that stamp of approval. This is the same sort of criteria we demonstrated when we went to the Old Testament. We said, hey, these later editorial additions, those stamps of approval would have been done likely by Ezra, or at least stopped with Ezra. And so there may have been many approved ones up to Ezra, but Ezra would have been the final line. So the next one was, when was the book written? When was the book written? Because there's a lot of forgeries throughout church history, right? Gospel of Thomas acts like it was written by Thomas himself. The Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Peter. These come into church history as if they're ancient writings. And the church has to work through those and say, these aren't ancient at all. And because they're not ancient, so it's read Gospel of Peter. Well, that sounds like it's written by Peter. We saw this with Athanasius. Athanasius said that there are books written by that are named as if though they're written by apostolic men or apostles themselves, and therefore cause confusion in new church members. And that's why he lists them as heresy, rejected. We're not using these, because they were able to determine that these were not ancient books. So late books, we say no, that's important. We can't do those. They have to be written in the time period. They have to be written in the time period of the apostles. What language was it written in? All right. Well, the apostles wrote in Greek. So if the book was written in something like Latin or Aramaic for the New Testament, this would have been rejected as well. In fact, interestingly enough, we have two, what's the word I'm looking for? Two testimonies that Matthew potentially wrote his gospel in the language of the Hebrews as well. We have no record of that, no extant record. We can't pick up any manuscript anywhere and say, oh, that's the Gospel of Matthew in the Hebrew language. I'm not saying that his book was rejected because it was in Hebrew. I'm not even sure whether or not one was written. I have no reason to deny it. We just don't have any extant copies of it, so I don't put a lot of weight there. However, even if he did, what was clearly received by the church was his Greek New Testament, was his Greek gospel. That's what was received, not his Hebrew one. What language was it in becomes part of the criteria. And the last one, has the book been received and read in churches, right? So if it's something that comes up today, this becomes a question. Have we received this throughout church history? And if the answer is no, then this becomes another point against the book. So case in point, the book of Hebrews is a disputed book. It's consistently disputed in the early church. Why? Largely because of criteria number one. Who wrote the book? Because it's written in the right time period, it's written in the right language, and it's been received by most churches. Most churches received the book of Hebrews. This was a dispute among some churches. And so who wrote the book becomes the criteria as to whether or not it should be accepted in the canon. And so we will pick that up next week. This is what we call canon lists in Christendom, the subsections. Okay, so remember, I'm going to end with this. We'll close the class with this. Remember when we had the Old Testament, we had the Tanakh, a division of the Old Testament. Well, we have something similar in the New Testament. We have a division in the New Testament. We have the four Gospels, or the Gospels. We have Acts, the Pauline epistles, the Catholic epistles, and Revelation. Don't be scared by the term Catholic epistle there. It just means general. We also call them general epistles, but when you read the writings, you'll see Catholic epistles. Just means that they weren't written to a specific church, like Paul to the Galatians or to the Ephesians or to the Corinthians. These are written more generically, not to any individual church, but to a diaspora or something else. So this is just that word for that. It's not written to a particular church. All right, we'll pick this up next week. We'll continue with Hebrews, why it was disputed, and ultimately how it gets settled. We're not going to go into Luther's arguments or Reformation era on this subject because, one, we just dealt with it, and two, Luther was the only one. As far as I can tell, he was the only one who was disputing these things. So it gets resettled again, if you will, reaffirmed in the Reformation by other Protestants, and we'll go from there. So that's it. You all are dismissed. Thank you.